Alright guys, we're gonna get started. If you're in the class, thanks for showing up. If you're not in the class, thanks for coming to this, the third talk in our installment of the Hard Earth seminar series, where graduate students talk about their research, how it relates to sustainability, and some of these really broad, interesting dilemmas that have to do with achieving sustainability, because we know that sustainability is hard to achieve. So I'm excited that you're here and here to talk about this. I'm just gonna get right into introducing our wonderful speakers, because I think they're gonna have a lot of interesting and great things to say. You're gonna want to hear them. So tonight's talk is entitled "Bad Words," and Gregg and Sandra will be presenting today. Gregg Sparkman is a PhD student in the psychology department at Stanford. He uses national surveys and field studies to develop and assess social psychological interventions to encourage conservation behaviors, including reducing meat consumption, conserving household water, and reducing home energy use. In these domains, he examines the role of key psychological drivers of actions such as social norms, identities, and morality. Gregg received his undergraduate degrees in psychology and anthropology from the University of California, Berkeley. Before coming to Stanford, Gregg worked as a research associate and volunteered for the Greater Good Science Center. Sandra Nakagawa is also a PhD candidate, but she's in the sociology department. She also graduated from the University of California, Berkeley, with bachelor's degrees in sociology and English. Sandra's research focuses on gender differences in health and environmental behaviors. In particular, her work looks at how concerns about masculinity contribute to men's lower rates of many healthy and pro-environmental activities. So before I introduce these two, or before we welcome them to the stage, I just wanted to note that we have these little cards that I'm going to pass around, and while you're listening to Gregg and Sandra speak, it would be great if you could fill out your name and email address if you're interested in learning more about the wonderful things that are happening within the storm. This speaker series is part of a broader initiative within Roble Hall to engage students in sustainability challenges. This includes service projects as well as an organic garden and other wonderful things that are happening. So if you're interested in hearing more, please fill out your email address. Additionally, at the bottom, if these talks are interesting to you, and I'm sure that they will be, then please let us know sort of what other topics you'd be interested in hearing about. I think it would be great to get the perspective of those in the audience so that we can put on talks that people want to come to, actually. So I'm going to pass these around. And as I do that, please join me in welcoming Gregg and Sandra.
Thanks for the introduction, Andrew. So today I'm going to be talking about my research, Gregg's talk about some of his, but one kind of puzzle that you might think about is, why does behavior and individual behavior matter? We often talk about sustainability in terms of technology, but a 2014 IPCC report, so Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, estimates that behavior change alone could reduce energy use in buildings by 50%. So no new technology, no change to infrastructure. There's a lot of potential for human behavior. Also, every day we make lots of small choices that add up over time and across populations. There's also something called the efficiency gap. So there are a lot of what we would think of as low-hanging fruit when it comes to sustainability and behavior. So things that actually make economic sense. So changing out to LED or compact fluorescent light bulbs from incandescent will save money on energy, but people don't do it. So, or not all the time as much as you would think, given that economic theories would say if it's rational, you should just do it. So if we look at the sort of social factors and the things that shape behavior, it can help us understand things like the efficiency gap. Similarly, has anyone heard of Jevons paradox? One? Okay. So it's this idea that as efficiency increases, sometimes consumption can paradoxically increase too. So right now, say we have cars on the road that are not very fuel efficient. If we want to lower emissions, we'll say, okay, make more fuel efficient cars. But sometimes what happens is people end up driving more than they would have if they had a less fuel efficient car. So understanding the motivations behind people's decisions about what they do can address things like Jevons paradox, or at least help us consider that when making policy. And both Gregg and I are going to be talking about one specific behavior in our research, though we both look at a wide variety of sustainable behaviors, and that's meat consumption. You might think, why meat? One is that agriculture is a huge part of global emissions, 15 to 18% by one estimate. And the environmental resources required for plant-based versus animal-based foods are really different. So things we care about if we're interested in sustainability, like water, land use, greenhouse gas emissions. I'm going to show you a chart from the World Resources Institute. Blue bars are water, green, land, and then orange is greenhouse gas emissions. On the left here, we've got plant-based foods. On the right, animal-based foods. You can see beef over there. Very big impact in terms of water, land, greenhouse gas emissions compared to other animal-based products, and all the animal-based products on most indicators a lot less efficient and more resource-intensive than plant-based foods. Also, another reason to focus on meat is that something a lot of us make decisions about every day. So, and not just, am I going to be vegan or am I going to eat steak at every meal, but like, you know, what kind of meat am I going to eat, what portion, how often. Those are all choices we make, often on a daily basis. Also, people in North America consume far more protein than is required for our nutrition, so about double. So here's a graph from the World Resources Institute. That black line is the average daily protein requirement, so how much we need to live. And the farthest right there is US and Canada. Green, plant-based protein, red, animal-based protein. So we get way more than we need, and a lot of it, that excess, is animal-based protein. Another reason to look at meat, eating more plant-based food is also linked to better health and longevity outcomes. And so much so that in the US, some of our current rates of eating meat, and especially red meat and processed meat at high rates, that leads to a lot of lifestyle-related disease and early death. So it's an area where you get to make a lot of choices about it, very personal, but also it can have this big impact, not just in terms of sustainability, but also health. So now I'm going to turn over to Gregg to talk a little bit about how behavioral science can help reduce meat consumption.
So, thanks for setting us up for that, leaving us on the little cliffhanger of wondering what we can do now. The first thing I want to do is just talk a little bit about trying to understand the psychological landscape for different problems you're wondering about or different behaviors you're trying to understand. So if you are hoping to change someone's behavior or have some kind of intervention or anything like that, the first step before you jump into trying to develop a solution is to first kind of back up and try to understand that problem and why it exists. So in this case, what we're going to talk about is things that are populating that psychological landscape for decision making about meat consumption. So when we do this in psychology, we often ask a variety of questions, such as what kinds of thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and assumptions people have that are part of that decision-making process and part of their experience when it comes to those decisions. And then in particular, we like to think about what kind of motivations they might have, things that they want or don't want, as well as the different kinds of barriers that they experience. And by this I mean kind of psychological barriers in particular, so things that people feel like they're allowed to do, or perhaps maybe not allowed to do, or things that we feel like we're able to do, or beliefs about what we can and can't do. So we're actually going to do this as a workshop a little bit here, and we're going to try to ask how these kind of psychological processes play out to create or maintain the current level of meat consumption in the United States. So in particular, if you're sort of I was trying to think of like all the different kinds of things we often talk about in our discipline. So in addition to some things we just talked about, people have different beliefs and ideas and assumptions about food and food choice. They have different perceptions and interpretations about what their choices mean and how foods relate to their well-being. They have different attitudes and opinions about those foods. They have different past experiences or circumstances they're in. And then there's a variety of psychological tendencies that might be playing into any set of decisions people are making. So by psychological tendencies, I mean things like across a variety of domains, you tend to see people having things like self-serving biases where they tend to view themselves more positively than others, or people maybe are risk averse. There's like these kinds of things, and they may or may not be playing into these decisions, but I just want to kind of highlight that sometimes those kinds of things chronically are involved. And then, like I said, the motivations and different barriers that might be at play for people's decisions about food making. So as a group, I wanted to take a couple minutes, I think maybe 5 minutes, and ask, why do we think it is that people in the US eat meat, more particularly the level of meat that they eat? Another way to ask this would be kind of thinking like, why would it be hard to get people to change their diet if we wanted them to reduce how much meat they consume? So what I would like is, if people have thoughts or ideas, I want to try to map out all of those things. So if we have volunteers to let me know just in your own experience or what you believe for other people, like why do you think people consume meat? Why do you think they consume the level of meat that they do in regards to these kinds of dimensions and aspects we're thinking about? Yeah.
So it could be cultural. A lot of meat within your culture.
Okay. And can you tell me a little bit about, can you give me like either an example or something
So,
more about
say
what you
for
eat?
example, if there's a traditional dish in your family and like it involves like beef or like chicken or something.
Okay. And for each one of these, what I'm probably going to do is kind of like ask follow-up questions to kind of keep going with it a little bit. So there's a variety of cultural factors. This is probably going to be too small. It's already bigger. So within that realm of culture, in particular, you said the example of having like traditional dishes. What is that like a little bit? So when people have traditional dishes, they're things they're used to eating, things they're familiar with. What would it mean to them to go without it?
Maybe more of like a, I don't know, historical perspective and like the historical significance to their family or like their relatives or their cultural background. So like.
So it could have a connection to family,
Yeah.
history. Okay. And all of these things, like these, we kind of understand in an implicit way that we value those kinds of connections, right? There's some value in that. In that sense, like changing diet is like a big interruption to a lot of ways that people try to like make meaning out of themselves, ways people understand themselves, who they are, who their family is, what kinds of maybe values and things like that. It's a huge quadrant. I feel like there's probably more things we can add to this too, but and like let's widen that up to, it could be more things within this, could be just totally different things too. Other people's thoughts? Yeah?
I feel like there's like an aspect of convenience in like American culture with like the fact that we're saturated with so many fast food restaurants where there's just like an abundance of different meat that you can get, and then at the grocery store and there's like this big emphasis on like protein and meat.
Okay, so there's a lot of things in there that we want to unpack a little bit. So you mentioned convenience, in particular the kinds of options that we're given. So presumably it's more convenient to eat meat dishes then in the US?
Like I guess it depends. Like like a lot of fast food places like McDonald's or Burger King, like you can get a salad, but the main things on the menu are like meat. So I feel like there's less people who go out of their way to go there for the salad.
Okay, and so it sounds like one of the things you're talking about is that, I mean, the idea of going to a fast food restaurant getting a salad is weird, right? Like, so it's like, but why is it weird? Like, it's weird because it's like sort of presumed to be not the thing you go there for. It's like not the like default in a lot of regards, right? It's kind of like the what do you say, like token item, sort of like a healthy food or something. So there's this notion maybe that like, you know, that meets the default for like a meal in a lot of regards. On top of that, it's going to be more convenient when it is the default. It makes it much easier. Yeah.
I think somewhat like some of our ideas are from the government. Like I know that I was learning about this in my nutrition class, and like in 1992, like the food pyramid had like meat and dairy on it, but like now it just has like protein, which can include plant sources. So I think that like corporations and institutions, they can like sort of push. I mean, I like to think that people also make decisions based on facts, and then if the scientific community presents it as a like you need animal protein to be healthy to grow, otherwise you're gonna like experience deficiencies, and like that will influence people's opinions.
Yeah. So there's some on like a policy level, there's some kind of conflicts of interest perhaps for the USDA, given that like a lot of their investment is in like corn, which means that they need to be able to sell that corn to animals to eat, so they really want people to eat meat maybe. And sometimes when you look at like what the UN recommends and what the USDA recommends, it's like not the same thing. You know? But let's take that from that sort of institutional level and break it down to like how it ends up impacting people. So that's going on, and what happens at the level of the person in that moment? So it's like they're getting a coherent message about what they're supposed to be eating and what they need to eat to be okay. That's part of it, right? So it goes into beliefs about health, particularly maybe regarding protein. Did you have something you wanted to add to that?
No, that's okay. It wasn't
Welcome back.
something that was happening.
Okay. Was there other things that you were thinking about for that too?
Maybe like masculinity, I guess. Like, I think that, like, according to like gender stereotypes, like, I think just I don't want to like stereotype I just mean that like sometimes vegetarians are viewed as like somewhat less masculine or something, and obviously that's not like true, but like I think there are certain like attitudes that come with like different lifestyle choices.
Okay.
So like people view like vegans and vegetarians like as separate from like the normal population. So I think there's sort of like a
I think from more primal eras, like people when they were starting to hunt and got meat, that was something that gave them a lot of power.
Okay.
Not only because of the protein. I'm just in the potential this is how it evolved, but I don't know. I'm definitely I'm a vegetarian right now, but and I find ways to get the right amount of protein. But I understand what people mean because when you eat a little bit of meat, it has such packed fats and proteins that I think it really was a power source. People were able to build the sort of muscle they needed to continue like hunting and being apex predators. So I think that's where a lot of the potentially masculinity stuff is coming from. In that.
There's almost like so there's a lot of beliefs here that are very interesting. So one of them is this belief that like that meat equals power, kind of, right? And I don't mean to poke fun at it exactly because we're being a little bit agnostic about these things, in terms of like, but like understanding this is part of like a shared understanding, or at least a shared set of associations we have.
Absolutely.
Kind of. Yeah.
There's also a connection to prosperity and being able to afford that kind of protein.
So this idea that, prosperity, more so than even wealth, right? Like it's just like things are good if you can afford meat.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Even just in the math, meat is, you need 10 times the calories of a plant source to feed your meat that you're, then getting 1/10 the calories from.
This notion of protein, particularly like this idea of more is better. These are kind of like basic assumptions that I just want to kind of map out a little bit for us. Okay. And the prosperity equals meat thing is interesting because that comes out of like, I think for a lot of people, there's a notion that it's historically rooted in parts of the Depression, maybe. But in many other places across different parts of time, it's been pretty similar too. And it's funny now because now it's actually harder. Like it's easier to probably eat meat in a lot of cases. Like if you wanted to go out and buy fast food that was vegetarian, it might be more expensive. Or something. We got to kind of a weird place in that regard.
But there's also with that prosperity, there's class and social status connected to that.
Yeah. Okay.
A lot of people just also like the taste of meat. I have a few friends that tried to be vegan / vegetarian this week, and they didn't make it through one meal. Because they
one
just
meal? Really?
Yeah.
What happened? No, tell me what happened. I want to know.
They just walked in the dining hall and were like, "I want to eat this. It's so delicious." And so I think people like the taste. And I think also just habit. Like if you're just raised eating a certain way, it's easier to keep going with that than change.
Okay, so the taste of meat. I want to focus in on that, like the sort of assumptions and like our experiences with meat. So a sense of temptation in this particular case, right? So like meat is tempting. Okay, what else gets us to like that sense of what the experience of eating meat is like? Yeah?
Like, I know for me, like, I like the idea of being a vegetarian in principle in terms of, like, minimizing your ecological footprint, but I could never personally do it because I can't give up the taste of meat because I feel like I've had, like, veggie burgers before, and to me the taste doesn't compare to the taste of, like, a juicy actual burger. So, like, I feel like I'm losing something in terms of flavor by not eating the meat.
Yeah. It's also kind of weird. I mean, veggie burgers as an invention are kind of weird too, right? Like if someone wanted to say like, what would be the best tasting vegetarian dish I would make? Let me start by trying to make a dish that's iconically meat-based and make it but without the meat. Like that's a weird way to go. Like if you just wanted to make a tasty vegetarian dish. But a lot of forces are pushing it there because that's like what food is. You know what I mean, right? And so like if you wanted to make vegetarian food, that's how you do it. So like trying to create like a vegetarian dish in that sort of a legacy space is going to be a high bar, kind of. Yeah.
Except the Impossible Burger is now here.
Yeah, it's pretty good, by the way. We actually have a housemate who works there, and it's pretty impressive. Yeah. Also very hard to get right now. Yeah. A lot of it though falls off the truck, so we get to try it a lot. Okay. Yeah.
And another one is just like time. I feel like Stanford is like different from like the rest of the world. So say like you're cooking and like you're buying your own groceries, like the amount of like time it takes to research to make sure you're getting all your proper nutrients, that you're not like that you're like getting enough like plant-based protein sources. Like if you're like, I don't know, if you just don't have that time, if you're like spending a lot of time working, or you need to actually like rest when you get home, or like take care of family, or like do whatever else you need to do, you don't have like, I don't know, the time to make sure that you're like making up for those imbalances. Like you know, it's not really feasible for you.
Yeah, and part of that is sort of like there's reasons that it's harder, right? Like if on every street corner there was like an amazing vegetarian place, right? Then it would be quite a bit easier, right? So part of it being not the norm and not part of the sort of status quo of what you expect at restaurants means it's going to be quite a bit harder to plan. Also, maybe grocery stores would be different if it presumed its customers are vegetarian. Maybe like a lot of these things, all these spaces would be different probably if it wasn't the default in that way. Yeah.
I think another reason why people eat meat is because due to like religious reasons, because in some religions they are kind of required to go and like sacrifice or slaughter certain animals, and then they eat and they feast and they celebrate as a result of that.
Yeah, and meat in general is pretty celebrated, right?
Yeah.
Even in the sort of secular context. Like it's sort of like the main dish. Out of like all, you may have lots of dishes, but it's like the main dish, right? Like there's something like, it's like, sort of special in a way, in a lot of ways. All right. Let's see how we do that. Okay. I'm really only kind of scratching the surface here. Like a lot of these things you can kind of drill down even farther in, and I just tried taking a lot of the ideas like one level down from like the way that we are normally used to them. And like none of this is supposed to be surprising really, but it's fun to kind of think about it as an entirety of like a force that is like driving like the decision-making process. And it's like this is what I mean when I'm trying to say like this landscape of psychological phenomena going on. So if you wanted somebody to eat just one, vegetarian meal, right? You have to contend with all of this, sort of, right? Like all of this is set against you, and is being experienced by people, and is going on for them, and that's going to make it a little bit harder, at least, quite a bit harder, probably. Okay, so the next thing I want to ask is kind of zooming out from meat consumption for just a second. Do we think that like this map and all the factors, and including the ones we didn't really get to, because I know that we didn't have time to get everyone in the comments. Do we think that this sort of set of variables and factors is going to be the same or different for other sustainable behaviors? What do people think?
Yes.
Yeah?
I mean, like with green power, it's not necessarily the taste of it, but it's that the normal. It's much easier just to get your energy from a power plant that burns coal.
Yeah. So there's a decent number of similarities, maybe not exactly the same as some of these things, yeah?
But it's just like convenience, and this is what we're centered around.
Yeah? That's a big part of it. Other thoughts?
And just like, I feel like food is cherished in a way that a lot of other things are not. And we're more reluctant to let go of like certain foods than like say like something like, I don't know, where you're getting your energy from, or like how much water you're using, or how you're getting to work.
Yeah.
At the same time, I think food is also a more accessible choice for an individual to change, because an energy source, for example, is a lot harder to make the switch on your own, unless you live in a place that has really good wind potential or solar potential, whereas food is a choice that you make daily. So in that way, I think it is actually almost easier.
I'd say culturally there's still like that imprinted like, I guess, power of say fossil fuels, not as much as in the past, like, but like in the 70s, like if you had a muscle car, like you were a man. That's
There's
like,
some similarities here, yeah.
yeah, and it's like that's one of the most wasteful like automobiles out there. They got like 8 miles per gallon.
Yeah.
But I mean, that was like a source of like pride and like a mark of manliness.
I think that, yeah, and my perspective would be that, like, you could imagine sort of a Venn diagram where this would overlap with some of these big chunks of things. Other ones might be unique or at least more extreme for food choices, or maybe not as big of a deal for food choices as they are for other things, like the ability to change. So I think there's going to be some variability here when we try to think about the diverse set of factors going on for food and the diverse set of factors when it comes to anything else. So there's going to be some overlap, but there's going to be quite a bit of differentiation. Do we think that we're going to have the same kind of map here if we just had a different population? Like, if we asked the same set of questions about people not in the U.S.? Like, if it was Mexico, if it was India, if it was China?
I think it's kind of unique about population, because I think like certain subsets of the American population, I think this conversation would be super easy with, to be like, hey, be vegan, and be like, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, right. Yeah, even within the U.S. Yeah. Okay. What? Yeah.
I think it depends on the demographic of the population you're living with.
Okay. In what way?
I mean, depending on their ethnicity, their culture, their beliefs, it's a mixture of like different percentages of different spaces of people and what they believe and how they see the world and how that affects their decisions to eat meat or not.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think that we have some reason to believe that this could be quite variable among different populations, even within the United States. There's going to be some things maybe that are going to overlap, or some things you'd be like, oh, that's the same as, you know, or at least functionally the same. And then I think also across different times, in the past and future, you might find that this map would actually look quite a bit different too for people, even within the same population over time. So part of the reason I want to kind of highlight this is just to say that it's a sort of difficult set of problems to solve. So if you wanted to come up with a solution that managed to address all of these things, it's really still going to be a solution that's within a cross-section of things. It's within like a very particular kind of behavior, it's within a very particular population, a very particular time. And if you wanted to try to reach like a certain depth of understanding, so the solution you created was particularly precise to help knock out certain aspects of what maintains this thing, that solution wanted to be savvy to all of that and also be able to be different for different parts of the population. That's part of the reason this is a very difficult space. Sustainable behavior in general is hard to find. You don't generally find panaceas, you don't generally find silver bullets, you don't find those kinds of things within sustainable behavior and potential solutions for it, in part because of the diversity of the psychological landscapes for each different kind of thing for different people. Now particularly, I'm going to hone in on a lot of what my research is about, which is social norms, and a lot of what's kind of going on here has to do with our sense of what the norm is and what comes along with something being the norm. So I'm going to talk a little bit about descriptive norms. Descriptive norms are just what people recognize is common in the behavior of others. So when we come into some space and you notice that everybody's doing the same thing, you're likely to make a certain set of inferences. If everybody's doing the same thing, you might think whatever that behavior is competent, that it's efficient, that it's enjoyable, that it's socially approved. And all these kinds of things get automatically suggested to you by virtue of seeing it being very commonplace. Essentially, people tend to have this practice where when you recognize that the majority of people do something, you think it must be the norm for some reason. And then you try to start generating these inferences to populate and explain to yourself why it is that most people do that. And in doing so, you're likely to end up generating a lot of positive things, and that's kind of what leads to this pressure to conform in a lot of cases. It leads people to sort of self-persuade into doing whatever that behavior is. And part of that is, I think people normally think of norms as being influential through like peer pressure, just that notion that, oh, I do it because if I didn't do it, people would judge me. There's like social reputational costs on the line. But there's a lot more than that when it comes to social influence. There's a lot of informational influence, which is all these other ideas, these beliefs about what's necessary, what's true. All those things get affected when something has a normative status. So this, while problematic in the context of meat, in other cases has been used and harnessed for pro-environmental behaviors. So in the past, for example, they had studies where they would tell people in hotels that a majority of hotel patrons reused their towels, and they found that those who got that message compared to a variety of other kinds of sustainability messages were much more likely to reuse their towels as well to conserve the water it takes to wash them, the electricity it takes to wash them. They've also done studies where how littered an environment is greatly impacts the likelihood that someone is going to themselves litter something when they're in that environment. And similarly, they've done research where you tell people that most people are making an effort to consider paper towels, and individuals who use that restroom, if they see that kind of message, are themselves also more likely. One thing that's kind of interesting about a lot of this work too is that people tend to, when you guess what's going to be influential, they tend to rate like normative information as like one of the lower things. Like they don't think people were very influenced by it. And then when you actually go out and do like randomized controlled trial studies on behavior, you tend to find it's one of the more influential things. And I think that's because we understand norms often at first just as like, oh, do I care that everybody does that? And like it's not necessarily that you're like supremely concerned with what everyone does and what you do and if you do the same thing or not, but it's usually just you're trying to think like, oh, is this a good idea, is this a bad idea? And then in the absence of other information, the norm is like, seems like maybe it is. Like, so it's actually that you're using other sources of influence that you're just gleaning from the fact that it's a norm. It's not like that it's a norm itself that's making it influential. This is also used in social norm feedback interventions for utilities. So for power and electricity, in most major cities now, I think, they have a thing where it shows you your energy use versus your neighbor's energy use. So a lot of people who are high users might get something in their bill where it says your energy use, and it has this bar, and then your neighbor's, and it shows like a little message that says that's more than average, or something like that. And these kinds of programs, like I said, have been done both for energy and water, and they usually show that you get people to make reductions in energy use or water use. I think the national average for these programs for energy use is something like 2 or 3%. So this is just like something like a leaflet they put in someone's bill and sent out. And then like the returns on energy savings were like 2 or 3%. So it's kind of like, why not do that? It didn't cost much. It didn't really, you know what I mean? It wasn't like a huge change. And it's not a big behavioral difference necessarily, but like it's sort of like low-hanging fruit. And it's also like not very honed. It's not a very precise intervention per se. It's just like we just tried something and it helped, so we kept doing it. And for water, I think they had one in East Bay they did recently like this, and it saved about 7% of water, so that was pretty good too. So they have interventions like this in those kinds of contexts as well that use norms. However, one kind of question that kind of looms large if you're familiar with that literature is like, well, what do you do then when the norm's bad? Like if the norm's good, you advertise the norm, people conform to it, that's nice, you can get a little bit of more pro-environmental behavior. But what do you do when the norm is unsustainable? And for a lot of things that people might be concerned about for environmental behavior, the norms aren't very good in the United States. So people often drive along, they fly frequently, they regularly consume meat, they dispose of products that are working for newer models, they might decide disposable things, they're not very motivated to like switch to energy source, things that could also be very difficult. In these cases, and many others for sustainability, it's very plausible and highly likely that norms essentially are perpetuating unsustainable behavior. That because it has normative status, it's going to make it that much harder to dislodge. Static norms look at information about a norm at a given time. So, you know, X% of people do this, or most people do that. By contrast, dynamic norms would be information about the changes in norms over time. So an increase if Y% of people now do blank, people are changing and now do blank, more and more people are doing blank. Gives you some information about the trend or changes in behavior in others. So I started off doing attitude research about this in an online context with national samples. And what we did is we just tested out giving people messages using these kinds of norms. So we told people that 30% of people make an effort to eat less meat in the US. And we'd compare that to a message that, oh, over time, people have changed, and now about 30% of people are starting to make this effort to eat less meat. And then we asked people, how interested are you in eating less meat? After getting one of these two messages. And generally what we found was that people in these kind of static norm conditions were not very interested. Just knowing that some people did it was not motivating, but learning that some people that changed and now do it was motivating. To give you a sense of reference on this scale, I think this is not at all, this is a little. So most people are somewhere between a little and somewhat, and so it kind of bumps them up to between like somewhat and a lot, which is like not too bad. And then if you had a control group we just didn't tell either of those factoids to, it ends up falling actually in between, suggesting that maybe the static norm actually hurts, reminding people that only 30% of people do this might not be helping, and maybe information about the dynamic norm might be helping. And we found that this was mostly driven by two factors that were making the dynamic norm more effective. One is that it increased perceived importance. So not just learning that someone did something, but learning that they changed in order to do something conveyed to people that it was important. Probably because people carry a lay theory that like change isn't easy. If someone's willing to change for something, they must have actually cared about it a bit. So they started thinking that other people thought this was actually kind of important when they changed. And the other reason that it was effective is because it led people to sort of forecast what the norm might be in the future and think that that future norm might be different than the one that is today. So they started thinking maybe in the future even more people will be doing this. And that was another reason that these dynamic norm statements happen to be effective. It's because they could kind of forecast and conform to what that norm in the future might be. So those are studies on like attitude and like self-report and stuff like that. I wanted to see if I could actually get behavioral differences as well. So I went to a cafe, I went to Bites Cafe in particular, on campus, and we had the goal of trying to reduce meat consumption in this study. We had a few hundred people who were waiting in line for lunch at that cafe fill out a survey. The survey is designed to be super short, the idea is that you wait in line, you fill out the survey, you finish the survey, and then before you're done, or by the time you're done, you have a little bit of time before you get to the menu stand. So you're kind of intervening in a really ideal moment, like immediately before some food choice. And then what we did was, in the survey, they got, again, similar kinds of messaging about like some percent of Americans who do this, or some percent of Americans who had changed and now do this. We also had a control that learned that some percent of Americans had decreased how much they use Facebook. We just wanted to make sure it wasn't just talking about any change over time, somehow making people think about time and stuff like that. And then what happened was everyone's given a $5 coupon for having done our survey. We say thanks, have a great day, and they walk off. And on the coupon ID ends up being identifiable to which condition you're in. And so then we see what people actually get, because the restaurant, to get reimbursed, has to staple it to a copy of the receipt. So at the end of the day, we go and we collect all of those receipts, and then we get to see what people ordered and what condition they were in. So that's kind of nice, because you don't want people to know what you're doing all the time in research, because then they're like, maybe they want to be nice to you, so they do what you're doing. Maybe they don't want to be nice to you, so they don't do what you want them to do. So we kind of eliminate those kinds of factors by doing this kind of a design. And what we found was, in the control group, about 20% of people got a meatless lunch that day. That's actually pretty high. In the static norm, it was about the same, about 17%, and in the dynamic norm, we saw that double from 17 to 34%. So twice as many people in the dynamic norm compared to the static ended up getting a meatless lunch that day. And to go back, right, the difference we're talking about is telling you that some people do it, or some people change to now do it. That seems like a small bit of a manipulation, but for people, it carries a lot of information. Like, they start leading to all these inferences, like maybe in the future it'll be different. Right? You know, like suddenly people are able to reach out to those kinds of things. They're like, maybe this is actually kind of important. I didn't think it was important before, but if people are changing for it, perhaps it is. It's a subtle change to produce that kind of a difference. In this case, double the number of people, going from a sixth to a third of people getting a veggie lunch. So generally, I think that this kind of information, we've done a couple other studies on water conservation and things like that, and have had kind of similar results. And I think generally this is good news for sustainability, because, like I said, a lot of sustainable behaviors are not the norm right now, but they are becoming more prevalent. So this kind of expands the range that you can use norm-based interventions to encourage sustainable behavior to things that aren't the norm yet. And additionally, the current energy and water use levels that were being used in the interventions we have now aren't great, but there is, tends to be in many cities, these trends of improvement over time in efficiency of people's home and energy and water use. And in those kinds of contexts, this kind of intervention might be able to be deployed as well and help greater increase energy and water use. All right. So I guess the last thing I'll say then is just that part of the reason that I got involved in this is because I recognized that when we try to envision doing things differently, coming up against a norm is a pretty disadvantaged scenario to kind of inherit. And in this case, what we're hoping to do essentially is take all those factors that are pushing against you and maintaining the status quo of whatever unsustainable behavior we're talking about, in this case meat consumption, and take that sort of social influence and sort of put it in reverse. Instead of having social influence being something that perpetuates and maintains whatever norms we're talking about, it actually becomes a force that's helping you dislodge those norms. It's getting people excited about that change. And that's a very advantageous thing to do in these kinds of contexts. So hopefully, this can kind of go on and become something that's used in that space. Thanks.
So, Greg just talked to you about behavior shaped by what we think other people are doing. I'm going to talk to you about how our behavior is also shaped by how we think about ourselves. And in particular, one way we often think about ourselves is in terms of gender. We are as men and women. So first I'm going to show you some data from the study. Can you raise your hand if you're a freshman? Cool. Well, you all participated in my study. I didn't know. So about 100%, basically all of the freshman class, during the student orientation, you might remember there's a lot of events, but there's one called the Zero Waste Lunch. And you could pick a turkey sandwich, a vegetarian or vegan sandwich. Me and Greg and a team of grad students were counting who took what. So let's just guess. So we have gender, men and women, and taking a vegetarian sandwich. So raise your hand if you think men and women took about equally the same amount. We're equally likely to take vegetarian sandwiches. Raise your hand if you think women were more likely to take a vegetarian sandwich. You were all right. So men, about 7.7% took a vegetarian sandwich, and women, more than twice as many of them did, 16.7%. big difference, though not entirely surprising based on some of our earlier conversations.
So can I just ask, so that meant among women, 93%, 83% took turkey?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's
So minority in both
men and women,
cases,
but-
small, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, not super surprising given that past research shows that men do eat more meat, and as was sort of alluded to in our earlier discussion that Gregg was leading, it's associated with enactments of masculinity. Like going back 100 years, there's evidence that it was seen as a way to revitalize masculinity when it was threatened. Also, when men experience a threat to their masculinity, they actually act in kind of stereotypically masculine ways to kind of get that manliness back. So there's evidence that when you threaten masculinity, men are more likely to engage in risk-taking, exhibit aggression, homophobia. Women care about femininity, but they don't seem to respond to threats to their femininity by acting in stereotypically feminine ways to the same extent. Happy to talk about that later if you're interested in it. But for now, just keep in mind, like men, they tend to react a little more because masculinity in our culture, at least the dominant models of it, are really about constantly proving yourself and kind of a very narrow definition of masculinity. So the second study I'll show you data from is a survey of U.S. adults, national representative. There's two measures that are interesting here to our question about meat and men. One is, would you consider becoming vegetarian at some point in your life? This is like not a high bar. Like, would you just consider, just even think about it? And it's 1 to 7 scale from 1, no, never gonna think about that, to 7, yes, definitely. And agreement with the statement, I would consider eating less red meat in the future. Similar to the Stanford study, we see the national population that men are less likely to consider being vegetarian and also less likely to agree to reducing their red meat consumption in the future. So having seen both these things and knowing a little bit what I just told you about masculinity enactments, it'd be interesting to see what happens if we threaten masculinity. Are we going to try to maintain it by showing more preference for meat? So one way to do that is with an experiment. So there were 2 conditions basically. So people were asked to please think about either 2 times or 8 times in the past when you felt very feminine or masculine. So men were always asked about masculine, write about masculine times, and women were always asked to write about feminine times. So why the 2 and 8 though? So this is called the difficulty of recall paradigm. It's been used for several decades. So for an example, think about 2 nice things you did today. Pretty easy to come up with that list. Like, oh, I held the door open and I cheered my roommate up for their midterm. Try to think of 8. It's a little harder. And then you're like, well, maybe I'm not such a good person. So that's the recall, difficulty of recall paradigm. And the logic here, right? So trying to list 8 times you're masculine is going to be hard. You're like, oh, maybe I'm not. And it's also been used in other masculinity growth studies. So I'll show you the results for women first. And, dependent measures, basically the same. Vegetarian, would you consider vegetarian or vegan that I showed you earlier? And then this other one, which is how much do you agree with the statement that in order for me to feel full, I need to have meat and a meal? For women, there were no significant differences by condition, whether they read about 2 times or 8 times. These bars look a little different, but they're not statistically different. It's kind of just random noise there. For men, we see a different pattern. So when men were asked to write about 8 times that they felt very masculine, those dark blue bars, they were more likely to say they need meat to feel full, and less likely to consider being vegetarian or vegan in the future. So it's not just that men prefer meat, it's enacting masculinity is actively seeking out meat and saying, I need it. So what does that mean? We showed that like men eat more meat at Stanford and in the national population, and they express less willingness to cut back when you ask about potential behavior change in a very like non-committed way. Just would you even consider doing this in the future? Also, that there's a kind of causal component. We're seeing that threatening masculinity leads to increased need for meat and less openness to considering vegetarian or vegan diets. So given the kind of nature of these talks and the question of like, what does this mean for sustainable behavior, what I suggest is that behavior change campaigns, they need to consider like, which groups have the most room for improvement, to frame it positively, or who are doing the unsustainable version at the highest rate. Like, that's obviously where you're going to get the most impact. And then Also, how identity concerns come into play. If you're designing a messaging campaign, you have to consider not just what's your goal, but how might that come off differently based on how we think about ourselves and the way we enact the identities that are important to us. Not just gender, but race, social class, any identity, Stanford student identity. So I think now Gregg's going to wrap us up a little bit.
Yeah, and things wrapping up like real soon, right?
Yeah, how are we on?
So, yeah, 8:20 is our official end time, so if you have to leave at 8:20, feel free, but if you are happy to stick around, then
Yeah, I think the last
I think some people will as well.
kind of quick, but feel free if you need to go to something else to do so. So the point that we generally want to make is that, in these cases we had very small changes in wording, and they could produce pretty large differences, and we want to suggest to you that reflects this idea that how we see things is flexible, both how we see ourselves and the behaviors we're trying to decide. So all of these things themselves are a little bit in flux and can be manipulated by different things going on. And that in order to make sense of this space, to figure out what's true, what's not true, what's good, what's not good, what's filling, what's not filling, what's masculine, what's not masculine, what's easy, what's not easy, we're going to rely on social information to try to make sense of ourselves and the world around us in those ways. So the challenge in this case is that for sustainability at large, that each of the kinds of behaviors and things that you might be interested in, or each different space you have, probably has some behavioral component. And in this case, we kind of dived a bit into just 2 factors, but among many that we didn't talk about or have time to talk about, and really only examine people in the U.S. at the current point in time. So if you want to develop solutions for different things, it requires people to kind of sit and try to understand the psychological landscape for a bit. So, and I generally want to recommend the solutions that are going to be the best ones are going to be the ones that are going to be psychologically precise to why it is that problem exists already. So getting a sense of what this space is and developing solutions that particularly target active components in that space that are making it difficult for you are going to create the better solutions. So we have Q&A, but actually what I want to mention, because that'll be at the very end, is a few things. One, in the future, more information to be announced, we're going to have a workshop on energy and water conservation where myself and Sandra, maybe some other people, are going to help kind of develop and lay out this for particular behaviors that are going on in Roble for energy and water conservation. And we're happy to do that. So look out for that information. I also wanted to make a plug for a class, Psychology 138, which is called Wise Interventions. They go through a variety of ways to influence the construal and change people's behavior. And it's a great class for learning how to develop interventions for behavior. And the last thing I want to mention is something called SEB. That's the Stanford Environmental Behavior Group. It's a group of grad students and postdocs, and we study environmental behavior, and we like to workshop things. So if people have ideas or problem spaces or things like that, we're happy to entertain them. So feel free to reach out. All right, thank you. So any questions?
So with the gender study research that you've been doing, have you looked into how people who are non-conforming to a gender or transgender differ in terms of their receptiveness to being vegetarian?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it is difficult to get large populations of people who identify as trans, though there's definitely research that to the extent that people vary in how much they care about traditional masculinity, that can affect behavior. So one study looked at getting, so in addition to sustainable behaviors, men are less likely to do many common health practices like getting flu shots, preventative care. So men who had more traditional masculinity beliefs were much less likely to, so it definitely is affected by the degree to which one kind of endorses or enacts traditional gender roles, and it's totally reason to believe these things are changing too. But I have not specifically looked at that with vegetarianism. Yeah, it'd be very interesting.
I've got a question for you, Greg, on your research. Do you think that the results might have been different had, I guess the figure that you were using in your surveys was 30%. But if the figure had been lower, say it was a different variable, and it was 10% or so, do you think that would have had an impact on
Yeah, we went with 30% for a couple reasons. One is believability. Like when you ask people what percent they think 30%. And I actually think 30% for both numbers, which is kind of funny because it's like, did you think that no one was doing it 5 years ago? Or like how do you, but people probably don't think about both numbers at the same time very much is what that suggests. But I think that we picked 30% because it was our intuition that that would be something of influence. There's some research that shows that sometimes having a really small number in a group start to change your behavior is enough for other people to start considering it. But I think that the range of efficacy is going to depend a bit on like maybe how hard that change was, maybe other information that is used. But I think if it was lower in our case, in the particulars of meat consumption, that I think it probably would not have been as effective, right? If it was just 5% of people started to do this, people might be like, okay. Like, it might not carry the same sense of weight. It might not shift their sense that things will be different in the future. To the extent that it interrupts the processes that were effective, the sense of importance and the sense of a changed norm in the future, if it divorces it from that by being lower, then I don't think it would be as effective. Yeah. Other questions?
I have a question just about statistics around meat consumption in the U.S. Is it the case both that Americans eat meat more frequently and that every time they eat meat, they eat a larger quantity of meat so A and B, are those true, and they're true against whom? So where kind of does the United States fit in the context of other countries?
So it's like you had that like general comparison, but that doesn't quite answer, it's not telling you if it's both frequency and volume in each sitting. It's true that Americans tend to snack more. Like other countries tend to do a thing where they actually like have a certain number of meals and they don't do more than that. In the United States, it's like it's your freedom to have as many meals as you want. Like Taco Bell's fourth meal, like whatever. So it might not be the case that it's always about proportion. But I think there is actually work that shows that I think we do both. But I'm not quite sure.
I know, the U.S. has a higher kind of protein threshold of how much in the USDA, but men start exceeding that around teenagers when they start being able to control their own meals more. That lasts all the way till age 70 or something. So there is a more than recommended, even at the high U.S. recommendation level for men. Women are always at the recommended level at all age groups. So.
I'd guess that it would be both. That it would be both the frequency and the quantity when they do eat it. Yeah.
This is for you, Sandra. So you talked about the fact that masculinity, or when masculinity is threatened, more masculine behaviors come out in response. Is there a way to sort of use that dynamic in order to promote sustainable behavior?
Yeah, that is the next chapter of my dissertation. So I'll tell you in June. But also, there's definitely evidence that it's been successful. I think one example is the Don't Mess with Texas campaign, right? It gets to Texas identity. It's more than just masculinity, but it was very successful at reducing littering in Texas. So.
What do you think of the effect of besides the ideas of the norm and conforming to the norm? How far does science help? If people were to hear, being vegetarian saves twice as much water as if you're vegetarian you save twice as much water as someone who eats meat. Do you think that impacts people in a lesser way than conforming to the norm?
Well, I think they're kind of related, right? So let's say you hear that fact, right, that it saves twice as much to be vegetarian, and you're like, is that a lot? I mean you have a sense of what that means, right? It's literally twice as much, right?
Yeah.
But is that enough by some other threshold we're trying to reach? Is it, you know what I mean? What does it mean? And interpreting okay, it saves water. Is water the thing I should care about most?
Yeah.
There's a lot of moving parts. So you could have that factoid and it kind of float there as something that seems influential, but you don't quite know how influential it ought to be. And if you saw a bunch of other people reacting to it, you'd be like, maybe that is a good enough reason.
But what if you give people a full what if you fully educate them about it? You give them a flyer and it tells you about the different resources and how important they are in the state they're in and how much is being spent on. I mean, not just a factoid, but the full.
Yeah. So there's a lot of organizations and things. Their first go-to is informational campaigns.
Yeah.
Part of the reason that I got interested in psychology and social psychological interventions was because, in my experience, there's a lot of people who like knew a good deal about things and how they were and how they played out and what their actions meant. They were financially able to make better ones. They weren't like politically opposed to it. Like essentially, they didn't have a lot of like obvious barriers for not doing the right thing, the sustainable thing, and they still didn't do it very much. You know, so I felt like there was something missing a little bit, kind of. And I think a lot of people in the field feel that way about things like that. So I think information can help, but I think the interpretation of like if that's a good enough reason or not, like there's always going to be some moving parts. Like it's still pretty complicated to go from like blank has this negative consequence to like I should change my behavior. Like, because maybe you're like, yeah, blank is bad, but I think that's more of a policy issue. Or like, yeah, blank is bad, but maybe a technology will come along and fix it. Or like, oh yeah, blank is bad, but it's really a collective problem. What can I do? Like, you know, there's many off ramps from personal behavior change. And I think the interpretation of what that means, like what those problems mean, is going to get viewed through this kind of social lens about how people understand their responsibility and things. And that's going to be shaped in part by how other people seem to be reacting to it. So I think that you can lobby both. I think information does help, and sometimes information carries with it enough motivation to do things. But I think a lot of organizations that use informational campaigns find that they tend to fall short of what they hoped they would achieve. Or, for example, there's a lot of work looking at things like compassion collapse, where the more people know about a problem, the least motivated they are. So they end up having very ironic effects.
The more victims there are too, yeah.
Yeah. When I look at the crowd, I cannot act. Yeah, Paul Slavic's work showing that like if you have like one salient, identifiable thing you can help, it's much better. But if you have like you tell people how big of a problem this is, they're like, okay, like there's like this collapse of the experience of compassion for them. So sometimes like information ends up having ironic consequences too.
So when you're asked about how we could use gender roles or masculinity to promote sustainable behavior, do you think it's more effective to channel the norms or the masculinity idea rather than challenge it?
I mean, I think there's a lot of cool work that can be done on both sides, right? So gender is something we learn very, very early as children, and so if you socialize into it, I think, you can think about how that could be changed, and there's definitely evidence that like definitions of masculinity are changing, and what it's going to be in 20 years is not what it is today. So that's one piece where they could definitely do that. And then in terms of using the existing norms, like I think for issues of sustainability, that it's kind of time sensitive. So I feel like whatever toolkit we have, if it's people are identifying that like, oh, I'm not going to do this behavior because it's not masculine, I don't feel right about it. If there's a way to reframe that behavior in a way that's consistent, given that men are like roughly half the population, seems like a worthwhile thing. But I think totally both sides could be avenues for intervention.
From my personal experience, my parents and my grandparents always say that I should eat more meat because it's healthy, and if you don't eat meat, then you'll be like nutritionally deficient. Where do you think those ideas come from?
What were their experiences?
Well, my parents, they grew up in China during like the Cultural Revolution.
Okay.
And so meat was rationed.
Okay.
But my grandparents, I think my grandma had relatively more meat, but she is still pretty adamant about eating meat.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds familiar insofar as it sounds reminiscent of like in the U.S. like the Depression times and like the value and sense, right? And there's like similar phenomena with like I don't know. Sometimes you find other things that aren't necessarily about health but also about status, like white rice, right? It's like white rice used to be only imperial, like right? And it's like now everyone can have it. It turns out it's not necessarily good for you. That's bad, but like or something, right? So there's like these sort of ironic effects for these things at times. And in the context of meat, I mean, it sounds like they have that belief, and maybe they experience things like where people went without lots of food. And meat, as we talked about, does require a lot of resources, so it kind of is an economic indicator that things aren't like going terrible, right? Like if people have the capacity to do it. So like it can also just carry with it all these associations of like things are either more in boom or sort of in bust, depending on how they see it. I think the health police are really interesting. You see so many studies come out kind of arguing back and forth about like vegetarian diets. It's sort of ridiculous. And I think that, you know, like we see with Sandra's work an example of like how you can shift around those perspectives. It's like you threaten someone's masculinity and they change their perspective on the topic, right? I think normative information is another place where you can manipulate those beliefs probably too. So I think there's a lot of sources, but I think the historic context sounds like a place I'd start for trying to fish out the answer there. Yeah.
Can I just do one thing before, I don't want to cut this off, but I just want to make kind of one announcement. Is that okay? Because I see people starting to peel off.
Yeah.
Give me 2 minutes real quick. Who lives in Roble?